To me now. Lee, thank you very much indeed. I didn't know the exact bit of 2 Timothy Lee was going to be speaking on. Had I been organised, I would have checked that out and had a look. But I think what Lee's just shown us from the scriptures is really helpful and applicable to, I suppose, every area of Christian life and ministry, but very much applicable to this issue of funeral ministry and so on. If we haven't met, so a hello to Tony, a hello to Jonathan, hello to Sarah, hello to Robert, who are here for the first time. Great to have you with us. And the rest of you, nice to see you too, especially those who are eating and have turned your screens off. We appreciate that greatly. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the funeral ministry. I became a Christian from a completely non-Christian background, aged about 17. I worked for 19 years in the business world as a chartered accountant, advising all kinds of businesses. I then went to Oak Hill College. I was ordained in 1996 to the best job in the world, and sometimes to the hardest job in the world. I served a 4-year curacy in an open evangelical parish, followed by just over 10 years as a rural team vicar, and then 6 years in a suburban church in Woking. Just so you know where I could have come from with some of this material, in this area, I think my biggest influences probably are people like Dick Lucas and the Proclamation Trust, and also Philip Jensen and others from the Sydney Anglican Diocese, who really helped me think it through. But one particular profound comment has really stuck with me over many years and helped me. It was just from a vicar talking to a new women's worker in the church, and she was saying basically, "Look, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm a bit lost. What should I be doing?" And he just said to her, "Just love them and give them the Bible." And those things contributed in God's sovereignty to me and to, I suppose, what I want to present to you today concerning funeral ministry. But possibly the single most helpful thing I found over the years is to continually come back to the task I was ordained to from the pastoral epistles, from Timothy and from Titus. And here the Church of England is unusually helpful, because the services for the ordination of deacons, presbyters, bishops and archbishops, those services, both in the Book of Common Prayer and now in Common Worship, they're all based on those 3 short letters, one of which Lee's been talking to us from. If you'd like a handout showing how I work through the links from those to the services in the prayer books, show up exactly what our task is. If you want to, it's just a kind of big charty thing, ping me an email and I'll send you that. Similarly, if you'd like a copy of the script of what I'm going to be saying, so you haven't got to write down notes, ask and I can send that to you. But in summary, there are 5 tasks for the overseer that come out of the pastoral epistles and are all picked up when we're ordained. And they're not necessarily in order of importance, but in the order they turn up in the pastoral letters. Here they are. You probably know them really well. 1 is defend the apostolic gospel by correcting error. 2, preach and teach the apostolic gospel. 3, set a godly example to everybody. 4, train up future leaders. And 5, do the work of an evangelist. And I'd like to suggest that keeping those 5 different tasks of the one job that we're called to, keeping those before us helps us keep us focused and on task. So we're going to think about the funeral ministry, and we're going to have those as our kind of backdrop, our controlling grid. Firstly, just a few words about loving the dying, or those just bereaved, before we, as it were, get to the funeral. And firstly, loving the dying and those just bereaved, doesn't the sheer privilege of parish ministry hit you at this point? I remember one Christmas, my wife Lynnie and I, we just got in from the midnight communion, so it was about 1:30 midnight, 1:45, and the phone rang. Yeah, the phone. And it was the son of a long-standing church member who was probably the only converted member of his wider family. And Robert had just died unexpectedly. So that was late Christmas Eve. And the whole family had all been gathered for Christmas at Robert and his wife's house in the village. And the son said something like, "I know it's crazy to ask, Tony, but is there any way you could just come up and be with us now, talk with us a bit, pray with us, especially for the grandchildren?" Now, such times are a privilege. But what they also do is win you real respect for when you then tell them about the Lord Jesus and his call on each of their lives at the funeral. Another point, when we were in Woking, 3 different members of the church family all had non-believing spouses dying of cancer at the same time. It was one of those weird windows, all within a very short period of time. And each of the Christians convinced their non-believing spouse to see me and let me talk with them about life after death. And so I took each of them. I met 3 times, I think, with each of them. I took them to John's Gospel. I took them to one of 3 different passages from John's Gospel. And at least some of them, and perhaps all, committed their lives to Christ. So it's a very privileged position we have and a great opportunity. So let me ask you a question. Here's the question. Which of the 5 tasks from the pastorals are relevant to loving those who know they're near to dying or recently bereaved? Defend the apostles' gospel, preach it, set a godly example, train up future leaders, do the work of an evangelist. I think probably, I can't make that finger go down on its own, all 4 except training up future leaders are relevant, aren't they? Do you see how the 5-fold task helps us stay focused, even as I'm going to meet with somebody? So in this ministry, resist the temptation to lay carpets for the dying. I kid you not, I could name the clergyman who did it, or to mend their computer, or simply to listen to their life history in long and painful detail. Ask yourself, if Jesus were talking to this person facing what they're facing now, their death or their loved ones, what would be his priority? Would the words kingdom or gospel feature? So do ask anyone you're told of who's dying. Ask if you may visit. Don't assume they're going to ask to see you. They may not, even if they want to or need to. They might think you're too busy. They might not like you. They might not want to hear. And don't assume that their loved one, even if the loved one's a Christian, will ask you. Be sensitive to the need to talk privately with the dying person if you're going, not just as a couple or a family group. You need some one-on-one honest time. Always offer to go, but of course never force it. That said, if the person's a believer in the church family which you serve, you need a pretty good reason not to visit them when they're dying. The dying person, though, will usually have a connection of some sort to the church, but of course it might not be. It might not be that at all. It might be a contact from walking the dog, from the school gate, from the pub or sports club you go to. A bloke I got talking to walking our dogs asked me to take his wedding. I know we're not talking about weddings, but that was interesting. And he and I are now reading Luke's Gospel fortnightly. So get to know them well is my next point. For a believer, if they've been a church member and you've got to know them over a long period of time, that's brilliant. But of course, you might not. I mean, that you might be very new to your role, or you might not have had the opportunity to get to know them very well for a variety of reasons. I mean, let me tell you about Jean. Jean became housebound just 2 or 3 years before we arrived in the Cotswolds, and no one thought to tell me she even existed. Oh, what a blessing Jean was to Linny and to me, right up to her death, and we were there. But you do need to get to know them as people, so they never feel, just like a task you're ticking off. I bet no one ever felt that after a private chat with Jesus. Think of the woman caught in adultery. I bet she didn't think, oh, he's just doing that because it's his job. Now, how you do this, getting to know people within the time constraints of your role, will always be a tricky, personal thing. It'll be a wisdom call that you need to pray through. And how you remember all the information they'll give you for the next time you talk to them, that'll probably need some kind of system, unless you've got a fantastic brain. But once you're face to face, you need to know or discover what is the main issue for them personally at that point in time. That's crucial to how you proceed. But remember, they may not realize what is the main issue for them. Surely if they're dying, it's to be able to die confident that they will meet God wonderfully forgiven. So that's the person, probably the person who is dying. But don't ignore the person or the people who are going to lose a precious loved one. He, she, or they will need some of your love in the Bible just as much as the person facing death sometimes. And again, you need to either know or discover whether they need encouragement to trust their loved one to God, or boldness to speak and comfort if their loved one isn't a believer, or being brought to Christ themselves if they're not. So how might the Bible fit in? Love them and give them the Bible, said that vicar. So how might you use the Bible to love this person, whether the person facing death or their loved ones? Well, let's start with the person facing death, shall we? How do you help a Christian facing death? Well, you might want to remind them of the gospel of justification by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. I'm sure you can do that better than me, but Romans 3 or various parts of John's gospel come to mind, or a very simple booklet like 2 Ways to Live. But you might want to be addressing specific doubts or fears that they raise, and need to be willing to look up the answer and get back to them if you aren't sure. Michael was a very lapsed from being a very enthusiastic Roman Catholic up until his late 20s. So as he faced death, his great fear was that he didn't feel sufficiently sorry for his sins. And he kept coming back to that. So I kept having to take him back to passages like John chapter 3, like Revelation chapter 7 and 14, or Psalm 23, or John 14. Because as he was getting closer to death, and as dementia was kicking in, he would forget things and go back to his early fears. Oh, I'm just not sorry enough for my sins. Their struggles will soon be over. And it may be that the fact that their struggle with sin will soon be over is key. Don't ignore that one. That one can be a huge relief to the dying Christian. Not just that they're safe in the Lord's hands, forgiven, justified by faith alone in Christ alone, but the ongoing battle with sin in their lives and their heads will soon be over. But how will planning their funeral service fit in? Because that may well be part of the conversation, won't it? Well, you want them to see that if they're Christians, their service can be for gospel benefit of all who come. So choosing hymns and a reading for that purpose is important. It's probably best if they let you prayerfully choose the passage due to time constraints for preparing new sermons, but talk it through with them. Ask permission from the person who's dying to tell people at the funeral stuff that might help them at that service. You know, the kind of thing. When Jean was dying, we had a good chat about today, and she particularly wanted me to tell you something, all of you, that because she loves you, she wants me to say this. If that's the heart of the person dying, that's a powerful tool in your hand as you open the gospel at the service. And if the dying person isn't a Christian, then don't commit to a particular Bible reading. That must remain your choice. But what about helping a non-Christian facing death? Well, this is where I think a lot of the stuff that Lee's just said in 2 Timothy 2 is very helpful. Be warm, be clear, be real, be persuasive. Remember what it says, there's only one God. He is both the who and the why. He is the one with whom you must deal. Furthermore, he speaks to you in his word and invites you to entrust yourself to him. That's the warm, clear, real and persuasive message. And what Bible passages might you take them to? Well, it's going to depend very much on how they are. How weak are they? How ill are they? How good is their memory and their mind? But again, John chapters 1, 3, 11 and 14, or any of those, or 2 Ways to Live, something like that. Something simple, but something clear. There'll be similar passages that'll be helpful when talking with the person whose loved one is facing death, both if they're a Christian or not. But a really good way to spend a Wednesday morning is to find a few helpful passages to share with someone in these various different kinds of situations. If they aren't already in your mind and you're prepared and ready, get ready so that you can just turn up a passage that you know because of what you've been getting to know about this person. You know that passage is going to really help them to see Jesus. Study those passages and get ready. And when you meet a situation for the very first time and you struggle, that's fine. Just make sure you give it some thought and prayerful research afterwards, so you're ready for the next time. So what about loving people and giving them the Bible then at the funeral? Which of the 5 tasks are relevant to loving those at the funeral? And how might each task help you do that? Again, I think it's probably 4 out of 5, not the training one. It's being Christ-like. So you're going to show compassion and tenderness and kindness and thoughtfulness and honesty. It's knowing whether you're encouraging and assuring believers or trying to win unbelievers. Nearly always the latter, sometimes also the former. And you will be correcting false understandings as well as affirming true ones. I remember going once to a New Wine Rural Ministry conference when I was in the Cotswolds, and a bishop was there. And to my amazement, the bishop said, "Always preach judgment at every funeral. When else will they hear it?" And that really is quite profound, hearing that from him. It takes a lot of courage, unless you're a thug, in which case it takes a lot of sensitivity, compassion, and warmth. But either way, it's hard to do well. But Jesus always did it well. I, for a lot of my ministry, didn't. So, of course, you might be like me. I'm not a thug. I'm reasonably sensitive, compassionate, and warm. But I'm always scared of how people might react. So there's my weakness coming to this. Now that's okay, because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing the right thing when you're frightened. But only very slowly did I get that bit more courageous. It was a long time before I even prayed that God would give me that gospel courage at funerals. I was that scared. Don't make the same mistake I did and give in to fear. So Tony and his wife, not me, a different Tony, he used to run the local fish and chip shop, and later he ran his own building company. So he was very well known, especially amongst the more working class folk of the area. A good friend of his, who was called Roger, had become a Christian many years earlier, but gone cold until he was facing death, and he came back to confessing Christ. I preached at his funeral on John chapter 11, Jesus' in-your-face conversation with Mary and Martha after Lazarus' funeral. And I offered people a tract or a private chat in the future if they wanted it. At the wait down the pub, I wasn't there. A friend said to Tony over a pint, "Great send-off, Tone, but your bloke went on a bit." That was me. Tony replied something like, "And you need to really listen to what he's saying, like Roger did, or you'll face God's judgment and it'll be too late, mate." See, Tony was way more courageous than me, way more, and he'd never been to theological college. If you're lacking courage, like I was, try reading Ezekiel 33 about the responsibility of the spiritual watchman. Another thing about the funeral thing is, I mean, you probably know this already. Expect the unexpected. "I'm really sorry for your loss," I said as I entered the man's home. "Are you?" "I'm not. Good riddance to the woman. Cup of tea?" I remember just revving in neutral. I couldn't think of anything to say except "one sugar." Another story, just before the start of a funeral. The funeral director said, "Thanks for advertising the wrong time for the service, Tony." Did we? Yes, it was really helpful. Was it? Yes, if you hadn't, the other half of the family would have turned up, and there would probably have been an actual punch-up at the back of church. Would there? I was beginning to think this wasn't my finest hour. So I asked, "Bet that's never happened to you before, has it?" And she told me that 3 of her last 4 funerals have been exactly that. You don't know what you'll find. You don't know what you find when you visit a family. You don't know what you're going to find on the day. You don't know what's going to come afterwards. if people make contact with you. Life, families, and relationships are so messed up in our post-Christian land. Well, ask the Lord to give you the words that you don't yet realize you're going to need. But there's a flip side to our post-Christian land, isn't there? Have you been noticing a greater openness, perhaps particularly among younger adults? But as I gradually took courage and preached judgment sensitively, I would offer the congregation a copy of 2 Ways to Live, the little leaflet, with one of my cards in it. If they wanted one, they had to ask me for it quietly on the way out as they shook my hand at the door. Now, that's not an easy thing for a non-church kind of person to do. So I was often surprised at how many, usually very quietly, said, "Can I have one of your little booklets, please?" Do you know, I so regret not being bolder at funerals until later on. Learn from my mistake. I so regret being so passive for so long. People actually want to find out. So aim to be very warm on the day in the service. Be warm, be helpful, be relational. Make it appropriate to the culture of the people before you and the person whose life you're celebrating. Remember, this may be the first real contact that these people have had with a Bible-believing Christian. And our aim is to cause no offense in anything other than Christ's gospel. Remember Paul's words about being all things to all people that I might save some? So if they want Frank Sinatra singing My Way to go out to, that's fine. I mean, come on, it's a great opportunity to weave into the gospel message a bit of a dig at the lyrics, isn't it? Love that song, but really, is that seriously what you want to say to Almighty God? I did it my way? That won't end well. Please think again while you have time. Let's listen to what Jesus said. See what I mean? Weave it in. Don't say no. But I do want you to learn to be ruthlessly efficient. My training incumbent, he would visit the bereaved once or twice before the funeral, then a further 3 times after the funeral, and he would spend pretty much a whole day preparing the funeral because the family chose the Bible reading, and he wrote a new talk for each funeral, weaving the deceased's life into it. I mean, it was brilliant, but we had lots of funerals. Did you know, when I asked him later, in his 40-odd years of parish ministry, he could recall very, very few, if any, who'd come to Christ through his funeral ministry. As a curate, I had the time to follow his model, but I knew it wouldn't work long time if I wanted to be faithful to that 5-fold task from the pastoral epistles. So here's a few things that I worked out gradually or was taught over the years. So I would give pretty reasonable latitude to the family. If they wanted a particular piece of music or poem, I encouraged them to write and to present a really good eulogy in the first half of the service. That was their part of the service, as it were. I mean, I gave them help in writing it where needed. I offered to actually read it on the family's behalf if no one was up to the job. And that was good, you see, because it stopped me pretending to be best mates with a person I'd never even met. But it made them feel the service was very personal and very real. And I always got them to email me a draft copy in good time so I could be ready to read it for them at the last moment if the reader panicked. But it also gave me the chance to give them a few heads up on what was coming. Sometimes I suggested little changes. But in return for helping them craft a service that was just right for their loved one, they were always happy for me to choose the Bible reading and lead the prayers. I wish, unless they were committed Christians or a committed Christian close to the deceased who was used to leading prayers in church, was around, that would be great. But they would allow me to preach on my chosen passage for 10 to 12 minutes, all within the second half of the service. That way, I fulfilled my task of preaching the gospel to all those who came to church. And you know, I don't ever recall getting any problems from any family doing it that way. And I ended up with a maximum of only about 10 funeral service sermons that covered me for 21 years. Because those most grieving would find it hard to really take much in on the day, I always gave them a full copy of my script of the service and of the sermon as a memento, usually with a picture of the deceased, but also for them to read later when they had time and energy. And often they did, and often it was helpful. Another thing I did was I invested time to get to know the funeral directors and all their staff and be good friends with them, especially on the day. But I did ask the funeral directors, after quite a few years of getting this wrong, to never book a funeral without consulting me, because their tendency was to book an available crematorium slot or a church slot if it was just a church service, and then ask me to do it. Often, I was already booked doing something important, or I knew that a funeral that day would put me under so much pressure that, for example, my Sunday sermon wouldn't be properly prepared. I and the ministry staff would, though, do all we could to accommodate them and the family, but they had to run the dates past us first. Again, it's focusing on the priority of the fivefold task. And the other thing is this. My computing background from the business world soon showed me that I could streamline the process of producing the service script and the sermon and personalizing the whole thing, as well as liaising with the funeral directors what was needed for the printed order of service. So I've got a Word template that just requires a number of fields to be filled in on page 1. And then all I had to do was print the service and print the sermon and email the order of service page details to the funeral directors. Eventually, I could return from the funeral visit and have everything complete for the service in about half an hour. If you'd like me to send you that Word file, it's on the resource section of the Church Society website for Church Society members. But if you're not a member and you'd like that Word file, which you can then amend and make your own, let me know by email and I'll send it over. But as I finish, let me just say, remember, be ruthlessly efficient. You can then maximize your time and energy for the 5 tasks of the minister, both with those around the funeral itself and all the rest who are depending on your leadership. Defend the gospel by correcting error. Preach and teach the gospel. Set a godly example. Train up future leaders. Do the work of an evangelist. I hope there's some stuff there that's helpful to you.